puke, here's a whole awful lot. Nothing is going to get better. It's not. Because my partner and I believe the wisdom of the Lorax's words, we the pro-stars will stand in firm affirmation of the resolution. Result. Developed nations have a moral obligation to mitigate the effects of climate change. The pro defines the following terms. Moral obligation, a duty which is owed and which ought to be performed. Developed countries, members of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Mitigate, lessen the gravity of an offense or mistake. Climate change, the change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity as according to the United Nations. In order to clarify the round, the pro must show only a moral obligation. The pro is not required to prove solvency of the effects of climate change. Furthermore, the obligations to mitigate climate change, moral or otherwise, of developing countries in no way negates the moral obligation of developed countries. Contention 1. Nations are moral entities. When President George W. Bush signed the AIDS bill, he said, quote, "Across Africa, millions are in a desperate fight for their lives. They will not fight alone. It is a moral obligation for the United States to help," end quote. Government is the group representative of its people. Thus, the moral obligations of individuals extend to their government. Nations act on their moral obligations in many ways, from helping eradicate diseases to aiding citizens of another country overthrow a tyrannical dictator. Nations can impact moral problems that are too large and complex for individuals, such as climate change. Contention 2. The principle of historical responsibility. Industrialization that brought wealth and power to the developed nations accounts for the vast majority of greenhouse gases. According to a 2011 study by the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, developed countries have released 70% of carbon emissions, even though they represent only 20% of the world's population. Although developed nations reap the rewards of their industrialized economies, the entire planet suffers from the side effects of climate change. This places a moral obligation of mitigation squarely on the shoulders of developed nations. Contention 3. Unmitigated climate change causing suffering and death. Subpoint A. Hunger and starvation. The International Food Policy Research Institute estimates 25 million more children will be malnourished in 2050 due to the impact of climate change on global agriculture. Climate change affects the world's food supply in a plethora of ways, including desertification of lands, drought, insect infestation, and increased acidity of the oceans, leading to the die-off of sea life. Parts of Africa and South Asia already struggle to feed its people. A 30% loss in a crop yield due to climate change is predicted for these regions of the world over the next 30 years. In the 2011 East African drought, 29,000 children under the age of 5 died of starvation in a 90-day period. The U.S. Geological Survey says the increased frequency of a drought observed in Eastern Africa in the past 20 years is linked to climate change and will continue as long as global temperatures continue to rise. Subpoint B. As climate change wreaks more havoc on ecosystems, natural resources such as farmable land and reliable water sources become more scarce, causing an increase of wars. Princeton University researchers discovered there is a double the likelihood of armed conflict in the southern hemisphere during hotter years. Security experts worry protracted conflict in the region will allow terrorists to take over countries like Somalia. Their close proximity to troubled parts of the Middle East increase the danger of attacks on developed nations. Essentially, the prospects of state failure and weakened interstate relationships trouble Western policymakers. Water wars may become one manifestation of state-on-state conflict. Competition for the increasingly precious commodity may eventually escalate to the use of water as a weapon by upstream states against their regional neighbors. For these reasons, we urge a pro-ballot for Stars 1. Thank you.
Okay, resolved. Developed countries have a moral obligation to mitigate the effects of climate change. We, the Con, strongly negate this resolution. We also observe that in today's round, the pro must prove that global warming and thus climate change can be completely solved by humans' actions. Before we begin, we find it necessary to define the following terms. Climate change, a change in the average course or condition of weather at a place, usually over a period of years, as exhibited by temperature, wind, velocity, and precipitation. Moral obligation, a duty which one owes and which he ought to perform, but which he is not legally bound to fulfill. Developed nation, having a relatively high level of industrialization and standard of living. Contention 1, mitigation is pointless. Subpoint A, it is not a result of humans. Attempts to prevent global climate change from occurring are ultimately useless and constitute a tragic demolition of resources that would be better spent on humanity's real and pressing problems. It is not possible to stop climate change, a natural phenomenon that has been affected humanity throughout the ages. Geologically, archaeology, oral and written histories all support the dramatic challenges posed that past societies from unanticipated changes in temperature, precipitation, winds, and other climate variables. According to NASA, sunspot numbers have risen from 1700s until today, based on data compiled by John Eddy, the Solar Influence Data Analysis Center. The sun goes hotter and hotter throughout its lifetime. This heating will melt the ice and the Earth and turn into a planet, into a hothouse much like Venus. By the time the effects in this warming trend are felt by humans, it may have become extinct. And the steady rise in sunspots may be responsible for half of the 0.6 degrees of global warming. The imbalance between solar radiation and the thermal radiation, which cause the Earth to heat up, melting polar ice caps, causing sea levels to rise, and creating violent global weather patterns and increase in vegetation density. Subpoint B, it's irreversible. Even if the world were to take action, climate change is unstoppable. In the end. Second, all of the purposes claims do not meet the requirement to stop climate change in time. Human rights, it's not too late to avoid dangerous levels of global warming. Fiction plans are already outdated. The plans all require heavy and use of energy systems that actually remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Very few scenarios give the future we want. Third, even the United States were to take action, it cannot help the unaccountable to the actions to other countries. China does not have the same policies toward climate change and the United States, and therefore is unlikely to do anything about it. MIMS writes, even if our government did act, we can't control the emissions to the developing world. China is now the biggest emitter of the greenhouse gases, and the planet is not naturally unstable. Autocratic political system demands growth in all of its costs. Thank you.
Yeah, you can just
I
text
looked
us.
at some of them, and she was on the phone.
I'm sorry.
Ready? I will ask this question.
Yeah.
Okay, do you agree with our framework?
We have, which was your
You
opinion?
do. No, I was just our framework, like the definitions and or stuff like that.
Well, what definitions are you talking about specifically?
The climate change, moral obligation, that we don't have to prove solvency.
That you don't have to prove self-sufficiency? No, I don't agree with that.
Why not?
Because why would we have the moral obligation to do something that we can't solve?
Well, we're not talking about if we have solvency, we're not talking about if we're able to solve the effects, we're talking about if we have a moral obligation to do something. Even if we don't have the resources to do it, we're saying whether it's right to do it.
But that doesn't make any sense. If we don't have the resources to do it, then why should we have the moral obligation to try if it's not even possible?
Either way, you still have the right.
But where is our moral obligation to? Just to like do nothing?
It's our moral obligation that it's right to do something about it. It's not saying that we can do something about it, it's saying that it's
So you're
right.
basically agreeing that there's nothing that we can do about it?
No, I'm not saying there's
That's
nothing.
exactly what you just said.
Well, okay, in your first contention, so point A, you say that it's not a human result, but are you aware of the fact that 90% of scientists believe it is human caused?
Yes, I'm aware of that, but I'm also aware that it's a natural phase that just like
Okay, so
global
you're
warming and global
disagreeing
cooling.
with 90% of scientists?
I'm not,
Because of your
yes, I
logic?
mean, no, I'm just saying that it's a natural phase that the Earth goes through. There's global warming and there's global cooling, and it always corrects itself. There's really nothing that like, there's really no danger to global warming.
There's no danger, so global warming is fine, it doesn't do anything.
Well, that and there's no way to fix it, like you already said, so why should we even try?
Okay, I'm not saying there's no way to fix it because it is human caused, as 90% of scientists believe it is. And second, you say that the global warming is actually a good thing. Well, do you think that starvation and all these things from desertification caused by global warming?
Actually, desertification is not caused by global warming because
It's the dry out of land, global warming is.
no, it's when farmers overuse their land and then it loses its nutrients. That has nothing to do with global warming. So,
Then the other question.
you talk about how. Can you explain your first contention to me?
My first contention, we're basically saying that they're moral entities. So we're basically saying that individuals can't resolve this because they don't have the resources, so the nations